Well, good morning or good afternoon to those of you who are attending today's EagleApps community webinar session entitled Customization and Configuration of the EagleApps System. My name is Dale Allen. I'm the president of Dexterra. Before we begin today's formal session, as we have done in the previous session, I want to make sure we provide some context, an overview, and a welcome to today's session. First, given the challenging times that are going on for all of us around the world, we want to thank you for being here today, joining into this community, and we hope everyone is doing okay. We do have folks that are attending from, again, Europe and across the United States, so we want to wish and extend a welcome to everyone and wish you well going forward. In terms of a brief introduction of the organizations leading the growing community effort and some additional logistics, I wanted to spend a couple minutes providing that for you now. A good overview of EagleApps as a next generation campus system was provided on a previous webinar on March 19th, and that and any of our other webinars are available on the EagleApps page of the Dexterra website. That overview session provides a high-level review of the reason for developing EagleApps, the features, the architecture, and implementation for this application-based student information system. All of our sessions are conducted in English and again are available for offline viewing. A little bit about Dexterra. We're a growing international nonprofit consortium that develops shared solutions to transform the ability to control, utilize, and exchange information amongst the products when you want. We lead these activities through shared communities to bring solutions to the market by our members and with our members, and with an interest in changing the education technology market. Our priorities are the development and creation of next generation education systems like EagleApps. Second, providing data management solutions with supporting business intelligence tools, providing integration solutions, and lastly, working on or providing thought leadership with a growing membership of international partners under the umbrella of the Next Generation by Design symposium series and activities. For us, partnering with Boston College has been a wonderful experience as an active member in Dexterra. They're helping to lead this effort, and I'll ask Mike to join us in a moment to talk a little bit more about that. As people may be aware, EagleApps is a fully modular solution for managing the core business of colleges and universities. It's the first service-based enterprise system available for higher education. In partnership with Boston College, Dexterra has launched a global EagleApps community of practitioners and contributors to help inform and define the future directions for this emerging next generation campus system. This webinar series is designed to inform participants and to grow this active engagement in our shared community. With that brief overview of Dexterra and a little bit about EagleApps, I'd like to ask Mike Burke, the CIO and Vice President at Boston College, who's leading this effort, to provide a quick welcome as well.
Thank you, Dale. Good morning, folks. Thank you for taking the time from your busy and probably crazy schedules to participate in this. We're excited once again to share what's going on and the work that's going into this system and the potential, and hopefully you'll gain some great insight into the architecture and technology today. But as I've said in the prior sessions, we're really pleased and proud of what we have here in terms of a product, both in terms of functionality and architecture. And the whole approach to being an incremental, modular, extensible application was something we really were looking to do. And we think now in this time of crazy economic turmoil, it actually gives a lot of flexibility to how you can adopt the system and how you could adopt functionality and integrate it into virtually any environment. So we think it's pretty exciting times, and we're very pleased to have the opportunity to work with Dexterra to build a community that would help guide the future and the support and the long-term well-being of this application, because we're hoping that this has a great life cycle and that it's is impactful for universities beyond Boston College. So we appreciate you taking the time. Please reach out to any of us if you have further questions or interest, and please enjoy the show today. And thanks to everybody on the BC and Dexterra side for putting this together. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. the big collaborative activity that Boston College and Dexterra have engaged in is really to help, again, facilitate this engaged community, to help us provide guidance on both the models for implementation, support, maintenance, gain input on an ongoing development roadmap, and really develop a long-range plan with advice from people in the membership who are leading institutions and trying to have real-life solutions provided to develop that long-range plan collectively. We'll also be conducting implementation studies with a select few number of institutions who will start to deploy this solution and help us to develop the mechanisms and documentation to support implementations going forward. And that will be discussed during webinar series number 4, both the details on the community and joining that community and the implementation study opportunity. Some logistics before we begin. I had stated last time, and I just want to remind people, pre-COVID, we had planned this to be a 2-day kind of convening of a community gathering to start to build together and allow for in-depth conversation and discussion. We obviously have moved this to a virtual series over the course of 4 sessions to hopefully inform, engage, and start to improve the understanding of the EagleApps system and approach. We really want to make sure you understand the product, the functional and technical areas, and the community formation details. So some basic logistics as noted on the screen, as well as some additional. So all of these events will be recorded and made available on our EagleApps page on Dexterra. For those of you that are attending, you have the icons that are listed for Q&A, the chat feature, and raising your hand. Throughout the session, we will be trying to answer those questions either directly via text that come in the chat or in Q&A, or one of the speakers may address them directly. So our members of our team are looking at that and will be responding to that. And the questions and answers have been quite helpful because it really is starting to form our frequently asked questions that we can start to share with others down the road who are interested in learning more about this product and the opportunities with it. Anything that is at the end, we'll also provide an open question and answer for you to post your questions again. Then we'll come back one more time and do that and provide a chance to continue the discussion afterwards if necessary. Today is the second session of a 4-part webinar series. Today's is customization and configuration of the EagleApps system, more on the technical side. And as we noted in the description, every educational institution is unique, and next generation campus systems must, among other things, support flexibility of the user experience, localized vocabulary and alteration of underlying business rules to support the various needs of diverse educational organizations. EagleApps introduces a number of design innovations for system customization and configuration that will be presented and demonstrated, including role-based application composition, business rules, management, localization, and flexible integration with other campus systems. Pleased to welcome our 2 presenters today, Tom Capetto, who is with both Boston College and Dexterra as a senior architect, and Hasha Maineni from Boston College. So with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Tom, and we'll see you again at the end. Thank you. Oh, wait, one other thing, Tom and Hasha will be joined potentially by a few other colleagues from Boston College or Dexterra, Linda McCarthy, Norm Wright, and Ravi Kasavel. So sorry, with that, I'll turn it to Tom.
Okay. Share my screen.
I can see your screen and I can hear you, Tom.
Well, hello, everyone. So this is a fun topic area, talking about all the different ways that we can customize and evolve the EagleApps application. Yesterday, we had a meeting at Boston College, and John Mahoney, I wrote down a quote that he said, which I think is very apropos today. He said, "We don't want to rebuild the past. We want to build a future we can't possibly imagine." And that can't possibly imagine, of course, comes in the context of COVID-19 and all of the changes that have been going on this past couple of months, But that's also part of the philosophy of the underlying architecture of EagleApps, in that we're building things for the future and things that we haven't yet imagined. And so that plays a lot into all of the different design characteristics of the system. And I'm going to give you a little tour of them as we go through today. Last week, I actually touched on a few areas. I talked about creating courses and some of the configurations that support courses. One example was the learning result catalog, where we can define arbitrary sets of results. We can associate them with certain kinds or types of courses. And then as we start wandering closer toward talking about course registration and program enrollment, the learning result catalog configuration will be a very important part of that. And there are many such areas like the LRC to help us customize the system. From an architectural perspective, one of the basic things that we try to do is to separate business logic, specific concerns around local processes. We try to separate them from the rest of the infrastructure of the system, and we try to encapsulate them behind services. Again, EagleApps is a service-based architecture. And so we use this by coming up with models that don't describe, it's not modeling a business process per se, but it's sort of modeling the actual things or nouns in the system and how they relate. And so we kind of have two parts of this design process, one which is deriving the models, and then separately and independently, we talk about the business processes and the logic and the constraints that we need to implement. And we keep them separate, so those business processes and constraints can be modified fairly easily without throwing the entire system away. Some of these business concerns, we've derived new models to describe them. And once we have a model, we can build a service. And once we have a service, we can build an application. So a lot of the customization and configuration, more and more of it, are actually surfacing inside user interfaces that allow human beings to interact with them without modifying the code. Last week, we had this little Tetris diagram just showing some of the clusters of service areas. And there it is again, broken down into a service by service layer. A lot of the things I'm going to touch on today are all in the green infrastructure area. So this is the set of things that we're going to fly through today. And we'll start with types and metadata, sort of continuing from what I talked about last week. I introduced several, or a subset of some of the course types that we have. Sort of describes, what kind of course that we have. All of the objects in the EagleApps system, they all have a typing mechanism. Sometimes we have a pretty good idea what those types are to be, and other times we don't, but in the future, we make use of it. So we have a very consistent service mechanism throughout the system, kind of whether we needed it or not as of today. But as the project evolves, we always end up making use of these things. So what a type is, and this was always I've been around types now for close to 20 years. It's kind of a slippery little topic, but they really allow us to kind of break down a predefined object, whether it be a course or a program, or it could be a registration, to further describe it in an object-oriented way. So those who feel familiar with object orientation, this is kind of the service analogy of object orientation. And when you need another type or whether you don't need another type really has to do with the slippery concept of what is the nature of the object and how do these objects differ from one another. And this is coming from the enterprise development world. This is kind of a newer topic. Traditionally, when people need to make a distinction, say between two different types of courses that may impact registration, we usually stick data fields or flags inside the course. But why we did that may have something to do with these courses are fundamentally different. Like maybe, one is a run-of-the-mill course that a student takes, and the other one is really a thesis course. And what else is different about that thesis course? Well, we're going to need to start tracking maybe what the thesis advisor is and what the title of the thesis was, how it continued, and that course continued from term to term until completion. It sort of is a little different fundamentally than a normal, term-based course. And so we can use typing to make that distinction. But here's an acid test. When we run into issues that say, we need to constrain something, or we need to drive a different behavior in the system, or taking on last week's example, only in curriculum, if it's defined as a lecture, then it can't be offered as a lab in any term. That's a constraint. And so whenever those kind of issues come up, we think typing. And so it's sort of a way to back into it from something practical. So types can relate to each other. In some of these relationships, we can visualize a hierarchy. It's okay if it's a little small, you can't read it, because I think we're going to go more into this particular diagram next week when we talk about programs. But this is an example of a type hierarchy to visualize all the different kinds of programs that are in play at Boston College. It's more than just majors and minors. We have graduate programs, undergraduate programs, credential programs, exchange programs, and on and on and on, accelerated programs. And all of these programs are a little different where their relationships are constrained. It may drive something different in program enrollment or academic record, or the data constraints within that program are varying. And that tells us we may have a very different kind of program. And certainly there is a difference between a pre-med program and a major. And the typing mechanism helps us understand that. So last week I ran through some examples of some of the other kinds of constraints that we do. For example, a credit course, Math 1100 may only have certain allowed format types to go with it, which in turn drive the activity types. And so we can work our way through the relational model of the entire system and look at that at a meta level by looking at how these types relate throughout the system. And so it kind of gives us a meta blueprint of how everything is connected. And that in turn may drive the activity offering types that are available or offerable for that particular activity type, for that particular format type, for that particular course type. One of the practical usage of types is that we use it to constrain data. And so last week I ran through an example where I was constraining the result values groups fields in the courses based on the type of course. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. There we go. So here is the type user interface application. So type is a service, and so we can write UIs off of it. I can select any one of these types. I've selected the lecture activity offering type. And yes, I can go in here and I can edit it. If I don't like the label lecture, I can call it something else. And then I walk through and I start seeing a bunch of what that type, that lecture activity offering type relates to. And those relationships are fully fledged objects in the system. So hold on to your hats. It means they also have types. So we get what we love to call type relation types. If you can say that 3 times really fast, good for you. And so here they are in this column here. So I have some relationship types that are linking 2 together that say that's allowed. So my lecture activity offering type is actually allowed and based on a lecture activity type defined in curriculum management. So a pretty straightforward one-to-one mapping. We have another one group here. Because sometimes it's just handy to be able to say, show me everything, or be able to constrain data for everything. I don't have to do it on each individual type level. And so I can group types together and then treat them as a whole. And then this one here, activity offerings or sections, as many people call them, they have meeting times, they have schedules. You know, they meet Monday and Wednesday and Friday at 10 to 11 a.m., you know, perhaps in some lecture hall on campus. So they have a schedule, and schedules, being fully fledged objects, also have types. And you'll see some of the schedule types here that are permitted to be used with a lecture activity offering type, which is mostly, looks like from this list, about every schedule type that we have defined. So anything goes, though I would really question the online one. That I would imagine would go with the online activity offering type. So, why we have different schedule types is that in turn is constraining and guiding the information that can be captured or entered inside the schedule. So for example, if I have a by arrangement schedule type, then I'm not probably expecting a time or a location. Or time only, I have a meeting time, but I don't have a room. Maybe department assigned, and I don't know what else is here. You know, then I would expect to have both a time slot and a room associated with that schedule. So let me just flip over here. And so I am in the application that manages metadata. And the metadata itself is usually linked to the type or the root type, or it applies to everything. There's 2 different kinds of metadata that we capture. One is the display side of the house, which describes and guides the application into how to present something when for viewing. And then on the other side of the house, we have constraint metadata. And this is normally what will be in charge when we're creating or updating an object. It's really to guide the presentation and constraints of someone who is actually making a change to an object. And so what's listed is we see all of the fields. And what am I looking at here? I'm looking at course offering. And so these are basically all of the fields that are defined in course offering. They are actually in no particular order, but there's the course offering description, the dates and when it was effective, the grading scheme, the maximum enrollment, minimum enrollment, prereqs. These are all different fields here. And I do have some flags inside this field constraint, which is to say whether it is applicable. Sometimes, you know, when we define an object, it has a whole bunch of things. We may be ignoring or behind everybody's back defaulting a value, and we don't want to bother the user with a very busy form with a whole bunch of fields where half of them don't even matter, or we have some other way of deriving that information. So in the case of course offering, the course offering is essentially a copy of the course in a particular term. And so we overlay, when we set up this metadata, we understand the rules, what is constrained to the curriculum and what can possibly vary at the offering time. And so we'll see that a lot of these are not applicable. So you can't change the course code. You can't change the prereqs or the co-reqs. These are kind of curriculum things. You can't change the title, but you might refine the credits, because at curriculum you may define that curriculum to say, well, it might be 3 units, it might be 4 units, it kind of depends, and at offering time kind of nail that down to 3 or 4 units. Can't change the description, but we can decide to say, hey, this is going to be a pass-fail course, and make that change at offering time. And so, so the applicability is kind of telling us what to show the user, and wherever we can, we try to minimize that, because we tend to use the defaults, and this tells us whether we have a default value that is set by the backend services. And going through that update process, the UI will have an opportunity to even display what that default is. And the other flag that we have here is whether or not it's required. And if it's not required, if it's required, then the UI might want to stop and say, let's not even bother, performing the create operation, which is usually buried behind a save button. Let's not even bother doing that. Let's fix the problems. So in addition to that, take name here. So we have some additional things about that field constraint that allow me to further constrain what's going on. Because the name is essentially a string, we have things that are associated with constraining strings as part of that field constraint, such as the minimum maximum length, a typical string length, how much room should I allocate on the user interface for what we're expecting someone to type in. And a string match expression, which is kind of a wild card for anything, but sometimes strings may get constrained to a particular regular expression, such as, it must have a hyphen in it, or please don't have any numeric characters in it. And so we're able to design a regular expression to catch that in the filter, and this object is what the UI has. And so it's able to do client-side validation before it hits the service validation. And how we keep all of this in sync is the service validation by default, unless customized, uses this same structure to do the backend validation. So there's no way in, but if somebody writes their own UI or they talk to the services directly, there's no way to violate these constraints. All right. So this is manage course. Let me back up here a little bit. So I don't know what I brought up name here. Entity constraint, default string value. So if I were to say the maximum string length is 1, just for, and what is the label here? Or maybe I change it. There we go. So let's see what happens here. So I'll go to the manage course offering screen, do an update course offering. Oh, and there it is. I changed the label, and I'm already violating the constraint I said when I set that maximum string length to 1. Now, if you'll notice that a lot of our fields here have these little things, I can wave my mouse over it, and there's little pop-up toolboxes. So let me update that. And that's the description here. So although this is a fairly vanilla description, you can put whatever text you want to surface directly to the user in terms of what should they be doing there. Let me set this back because I just made this change in dev, and somebody's going to notice. Let's revert my changes there. So through the metadata thing, we can do a fair bit of customization down to the field by field level, constraints, how the object ought to be displayed, what it's labeled as, and anything down at that level. Metadata can also be inherited because, like I showed you with the program type hierarchy, I can set either display hints or constraints at the very top and expect all of those to be inherited down the hierarchy. And maybe I just, way down at the bottom, I just want to tweak one or two things. I don't have to create metadata for the entire object. If it's not defined at that level, it always looks at the parent and so forth. So that is just one of the ways in which we can make a change to EagleApps. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about rules. Okay. As I said in previous talks, usually when I capitalize something, I usually mean an entity, a thing defined in EagleApps sometimes words are used and we use them in different contexts in the outside world, and it can cause some confusion. But nonetheless, rule is kind of an abstract term within EagleApps as well, although it does point to a physical entity. And the purpose of the rules framework is to help us begin corralling and encapsulating complex logic, which typically usually gets scattered all around the code of a system and things checking if this is true or what the value of that is and taking some action. We try to invert that process and collate everything and put everything under a nice, neat set of rules. And the first job of a rule is that it have an identifier and we give it a name so we know that what it is. And it's a very, very helpful technique to kind of keep track of all the logic that can often get squirreled away in code. Rules have interfaces, and so therefore its implementation may vary. Similarly, with the authoring of a rule, our primary job, no matter how we implement that rule, and whether we just write it in Java code or we integrate it with some offboard rule system, and I'll show you some examples of where we've kind of baked in rules for easy authoring. We separate the authoring process from how that rule is applied. And then we separate that from just the identification of the rule. And so we tend to do that in the reversed order that I just described. So there's an abstract rule. We have some input, we have some logic, the rule, and it produces some result. So our first job is we named our rules. We gave them names. Then what we did is we separate how a rule is applied from the base rule itself. So we don't tangle that logic. And this helps us test the rule, make sure that that works. It also promotes reusability of the rule. So if I want to impose some kind of check, but I only want to do that in the summer term for a certain set of people, I don't encode that in the base rule. I just code the check in the base rule. And then in a second rule, I take that first rule and then I apply it under those specific conditions. So we have a separation practice here in how we manage rules. And I'll show you the practical side of this soon. I would say 4 times out of 5, those applicability rules tend to vary by time period and population of people or set of people. So let's talk about populations. Population is an entity. It's defined in the population service, and its primary job, it does a few other things, but its primary job is to ask the question, is this person ID a member of such and such population? Yes or no. How that population is implemented, well, that's variable. And again, it may happen through a complex piece of logic. It may be the product of a system integration. And then we have a bunch of canned rules for easy authoring of those populations. Some of those rules may be looking at the academic record service. They may be looking at something about the student identity. They may be looking at authorization rules. It doesn't really matter. Any consumer of the population service is interested usually in asking the question, are you a member of this population, say, at this time, yes or no? So we had some canned population rules, and usually what we'll do in some of our rule-based entities. So population you can consider to be just a hardened version of an abstract rule, but for the specific purpose of defining populations of people. So I may have one population called undergraduates, and how that's going to be implemented is I went and wrote some code and did some queries against the academic record service. Maybe I defined another one called, is someone a full-time student in this particular term? So I wrote another piece of logic to go and call the academic record service and go find the answer to that. And here's where a canned rule comes in. I want to know all full-time students who are undergraduates. But because I have the other two populations defined, I can create that third population and select, give me the intersection between these two other populations, and use that to evaluate your questions. And so intersection is one of the canned rules we have in there, and we have some of the other set operations like union as well. So we can have another population to determine, who is an NCAA athlete, and we can talk to our athletic service to answer that question. And note that in each one of these populations, I'm kind of going after different services or looking at different data, but I'm providing a very simple and consistent interface for any consumer who wants to ask that question. So they never need to know the details of how that question was answered. Consequently, it gives us a lot of freedom to re-implement how we answer those questions without interrupting or having to recode all the consumers, which may be applications in some cases, but most often than not, there will probably be other service implementations throughout the system. But I can rope that one in with another intersect rule and giving me all undergraduates who are NCAA athletes registered for full-time status in the fall of 2020. So population is a rule-based service, and it's one that is actually fairly pervasive throughout the system, particularly when we start talking about authorizations. Boston College will be implementing a set of populations to automatically create authorizations for people who are appointed to job positions, as one example, but course registration, program enrollment, and the rules around that are also heavily dependent on the population service. So we actually have, it's called GES service. I put in the word configuration to help you out. But basically, this is kind of a key name pair service of sorts, where we can store and manage sets of configuration values. Most often than not, they're used to configure rules. It's probably not very complicated to you, but we also worry about the applicability of a value. So one of our parameters may have multiple values, and each value may be in play under a different set of circumstances. And although not exclusively, but more often than not, they relate to time periods and populations. They also can be applied based on an arbitrary rule, such as the third Thursday of every month. So here is an example of configuration that we manage in the GS. Actually, I think 2 of these were done so far, but this came off of a design document. Course registration is going to want to know, what is your maximum credit load? When are you not allowed to add any more courses? And well, the answer is it kind of depends. It kind of depends on who you are and even a little bit what time of year it is. And so we get to create these values, but think of the values as a bunch of rules that are being processed. So notice the second column is called priority. It's a processing priority. And so we do the 1s first, and we go to 2 and 3 and count up from there. And they do vary by population. So 24 units. If you are in the School of Management, or you're in the Morrissey Arts and Sciences School, or the nursing school, and oh, by the way, your GPA is greater than or equal to 3.0. So in other words, you're in very, very good standing. The law school has its own set of rules that's different from the rest of campus. And so first year students, 18, everyone else in the law school, 17, and they have this LLM student, which that's really only applicable to spring term. So, okay, we pulled that off of their law school website, and we encoded it into this GES configuration service. And then down the bottom, we start getting the catch-alls of things. We don't want to do every school and every department and every term on campus, but it turns out that the rest of the graduate students is 24, and the rest of the undergraduate students is 19. So here's a way that, no matter what the value, when you're dealing with something enterprise-wide, we're going to want to vary those values, bury that logic within the configuration. And so all of those if, ands, or buts, or every time that policy changes, we don't have to go upstairs and start banging on code with conditional statements or switch statements or the like. We keep all of that here. And the interface to the GS configuration service is, I have this parameter, it's called max credit load. I'm trying to register this student ID, and it's default term. So what number should I use? And the GS just answers that simple question. And all of this is the management and the setup and configuration of that behind the scenes. So what we're in something like course registration, I said that GS configuration is often used to configure rules. So if we were to come over to course registration or any of the other areas of the system where we want to check a bunch of things, we have another rule-based service called the process service. And the process service is basically a way of organizing check rules. And like the other rules I talked about, a check rule can point to a rule, it can point to a piece of Java code, it could be the product of an integration, and we also have some baked-in checks because we already have those services defined, so the services may as well learn how to talk to each other. So we have a hold service. We can check if a student has a hold, and we can block something, whether it's registration or program enrollment or getting a copy of their transcript. We can block them by defining a check or a deadline. This has to be done by a certain date. We looked at the academic calendar a little bit last week. We have milestones. We can just set up a check through a user interface. We can create a check and say, check this milestone type, please. So a check applies to a process. And example processes are things like course registration, program enrollment, getting your transcript, graduation, another process. And we have these checks. Once they're defined, then all we can do is just relate them to whatever process we want. So these check rules can be reused in multiple processes, and it is the instruction that plays the role of how that check applies. Okay, let me just here. We get to the next one. Oops, I'll do that. All right. So I'm looking now at the rule UI, and so we surface the rules. I can't author them here, but I can look at them. And they're cataloged in different ways. They're grouped together in sort of a hodgepodge listing of them. These are actually catalogs, excuse me. So, rules that are used in ATP indicators, program requisite rules, final exam rules catalog. Okay, so these are just the different categories of rules that we have. Here is an example of another hardened rule system. The UI is called the final exam rules. Specifically what it is, it's a schedule transformation rule set. So given a schedule, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 10 to 11 a.m. in room 10250, how can I automatically transform that to produce another schedule based on that? And so the application of these transformation rules is to automate final exam scheduling based on the schedule of the section during the term. Let's go through some of my tabs here. This is the population UI. And so I am in the category of looking at students by school. I can see active law students. Let's see what I can learn about this. And so it has a name. There's a rule behind it to go figure out who the active law students are. And those are produced by looking at the Academic Records Service. And we have a couple of interesting little tidbits here. Varies by time. A dynamic rule that if I ask today who the active law students are, or are you a member of that, that may have been different than the answer yesterday and different the answer tomorrow. So it can ask at a specific point in time, but that of course only if the rule supports it. I may have another kind of population rule, which is just a list of people and it never changes until I update it. And some of our populations will allow, though not required, but it can allow for the viewing of the members of that population. So I kind of sort of presented population as kind of a black box service, and that's a sweet spot, but there are places like in user messaging, for example, or producing cohorts of students where it's very helpful for us to have that rule support an expansion of its members. And sometimes the way you implement a rule for efficient expansion is different than the way you implement a rule for a one-off query, whether someone's a member of that or not. Here is the GS configuration service. I'm going to ignore the categorization here, but I am in the category for configuration values that basically serve those registration checks. And so these can be edited. Let me just slide this over here a little bit. So we have, let's see what the first one here is, the format string representation of the registration appointment date. How should we display that? Well, let's see what it has here. Let me see, view values. And so they do day, month, year, hour, minute. And if we wanted to change that particular configuration value, that was go to the action menu and then edit it there. But what I was really trying to get to was the process service. And so these are the instructions for student course registration. I actually have a different process for whether some administrator is registering a student on their behalf, and then we have different processes for enrollment and so forth. So not all of these are in an active state because development has been ongoing and people are playing with and debugging these different kinds of check rules, but some of them are active. So we have check number one: is there an available seat in the class? We have, do we exceed our maximum credits check? Do we need departmental permission? And so what's behind these rules does change, but again, the instruction is about taking a check that has already been defined and linking it in to the registration process. So can I do something fun here? Ooh, I can. And if I didn't want that check to happen first, I wanted it to happen third, I can just kind of drag it down. Let's look at the view detail on that. And we could see some of the information that's part of that relationship. And this is describing how that check rule gets applied. And in this particular case, it applies to fall, spring, and summer term, which is the terms that we have. I did just slide it into position 3. So that's number 3 in its processing priority. Failure of this check results in a warning, yes, which means it's not going to block registration, but it's going to result in a warning message that's going to percolate up through course registration if this check should fail. If it was not a warning, then we would expect course registration to stop. Now, do we do the other checks and give the students feedback on all of the things that are going wrong in their lives? Or do we stop and terminate all the checks because one failed? In this case, no, we would continue to evaluate and collect any other failed instructions, and return that to the user. Student is permitted to ask for an exemption. If the answer is yes, then we have an exemption service where a student can write a little justification about why that check didn't apply to them. And that could conceivably go to a workflow, and somebody could approve it and they try to register again. And with an exemption, when this check fails, that exemption will be applied and they will be able to continue. And here, the message is a sort of customized message. So even with the same check rule, if it was reused in multiple processes, we want to sort of say something a little different. I mean, seats, mostly course registration. I suppose we could have another service that has a maximum number of seats. And I can bring that into the context of that particular process with a custom message. And you'll see that there's like a little template language here. So we use velocity templates to do variable substitution to get the actual values that are like the student ID or the term ID or whatever other information that we want to stuff in the middle of that is known to the rule. So the process service in something like course registration or program enrollment surfaces through an application like this the ability to take these checks, pull additional checks in from maybe a check library that you have defined as they are developed, turn them on or off, apply them at different times, apply them to different groups of people, and change their processing priority. And so all of this happens through the application. And another rule-based service is the indicator service. So let me just pop back here a little bit, get out of this screen. Come on, guys, reload. Oh, there we go. My browser's getting a little slow. Too many windows open. But we have these little circles here, and these are actually arbitrary graphics. They could be PNGs or JPEGs or SVG files. Right now we have little initials inside gray circles, and this is telling us of an exceptional condition that maybe one might want to pay attention to. So let's see if I wave my mouse over that and saying, oh, by the way, just so you know, this course has a prerequisite. What does this one say? So Principle of Economics is actually part of one of those larger multi-courses that we talked about next week. Before you mess with this one, you might want to know that. And what's here? Oh, and this one here, before you mess with it, is used as a prereq in all of these other courses. Now, some of these are actually complex evaluations in a very normalized service environment. So we have rules in the back end go and make these evaluations to support these indicators. And, like the check, the indicator actually looks a lot like the check, in fact. It's a way to kind of group a bunch of these things together to convey some rich set of information about what's going on in the entire environment. And here we have indicator panels. So course offering indicator, let's say manage indicators off of that. And so these are all of the indicators. There's our little gray circles used as the icon document. And again, any image or even like an image of a word can be used. And again, somebody can come into here. They can add other indicators to this panel. They can reorder them. And at least have some management of that rule set and control what is being displayed. When Dan last week showed you the rollover results, a bunch of issues and conditions that was displayed kind of in a log format. Maybe something was missing a schedule, or something was not to be offerable that term. Those were actually done by evaluating a bunch of indicators that were grouped together to produce those rollover results. All right, and finally, it's my last topic. It is a service-based architecture, and those of you who know me for many years know that I start every talk with a picture like this, where I say, once there was a consumer, and once there was a provider, and there's a service contract binding them in between. Services can be layered in such a way that we can use the same service contract to make a stack, and these two in the middle, while they act as a role in the role of provider to the box above them, they are consuming the service below them. And so this style of things allows us to separate concerns. So for example, I can have one layer where I centralize all of my authorizations when I manage programs. Just put all the authorization rules in one place. And below that, I can say, okay, let's do all the validation in one place. And then what's left at the bottom, well, my plumbing. Maybe it's talking to a database, or in another case, it may be talking to an external system. The authorization layer is in turn going to consume the authorization service to do its blocking of making sure that nobody can change programs if they're not authorized to. And the validation layer in turn will make use of the metadata service to get the constraints that were configured in. Hopefully the same things are being validated on the client side for the most part, but this may also include some additional customizations of things that we can't actually code in metadata. So it gives us a hook to add sort of special rules and special issues directly in code that we just can't express through an additional service. So we always have that option. So let me, so I just went to the, menu and application UI, which is taking a look at all of these applications that we have. It allows us to think of our applications, the service model allows us to think of our applications as individual little consumers on their own right. So there's not one mega application. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of small applications, and it presents the problem then, how do we link everything together so that a user does not have to look at it as hundreds of little applications, but they have one comprehensive EagleApps experience that binds everything together. And so one of the concepts in setting up a navigation system to tie a whole bunch of applications together is the thing called experience. And these are the current ones that we have defined. They kind of loosely, I'm going to ignore landing page there, but they kind of loosely correspond to the role of the type of person that you have using the system. And so you might have a typical department administrator role, or somebody in student services may have a different or wider set of applications than somebody in a department. The CAS, by the way, is the central scheduler, so they're primarily concerned with course offerings and schedule, maybe less concerned about advising. So we don't need to show them that application. So I am in one of the experiences, and these are basically the top level menus. Oh, look at that, here they are. And I'm looking at them here. And so what I can't figure out, and this is something that we have in active development, so it's kind of fun to see on a day-to-day basis what's going on in dev. Let me open that up. All right. So I don't know why home is, what is that one there? I'll do that. Whoops. Decided to reload on me. So I don't know why that is third. So let's fix that. By the way, I have no idea what that error is, but it doesn't seem to break anything. So I'm going to move that in front of, I'm going to move that up a little bit in front of student, because I think it should be first, not third. Maybe I'll call it house. So let me just put it back there. Ooh, oh, I didn't change that. There it is. It did go into the first position, but I edited the wrong field. I changed the name of the object, not the label. This one here. There it is. There's my house. So the menus are configurable, and these are basically the application actions behind these menus. When they're selected, they may point to another screen within inside EagleApps. They can point to an external URL, so you can sort of pretend that there's a whole bunch of applications in your enterprise that are all part of your system, or just bring them together in some, for some convenient navigation. And they can also actually, application actions or rules, some of these menu items could just go and execute a rule for you on your behalf. So this is another way of configuring the application layer of the system. Labels can be changed, things can be reordered, things can come and go, and you can manage different sets of experiences to try to put in front of people's faces, the things that they care most about. All right. And I think that is all I had today. But another important part of the configuration of EagleApps, especially in implementing business processes, all has to do with workflow and defining the steps and the roles and the rules and the actions that have happened. We do have workflow services that are defined, and an implementation of our workflow service interfaces is the open source activity workflow engine. And Harsha will be talking more about that with you shortly. All right. So Harsha, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Harsha. We can hear you and see your slides.
Okay, perfect. So, workflow. Basically, workflow is nothing but a simple set of steps that will be executing in a particular order. It will actually process a work in order to complete a work. Let's say if we have a course that need to be approved by department admins in order to complete the course to be available for students to register, available to be offered, it has to be approved by, it has to follow a specific set of steps in order to get it approved. Let's say a university has a requirement that says that a course can be created by a department admin, but it has to be approved by a student services or a dean in order to get it published as in the course curriculum. Then that's where the workflow comes in, and it can be used at multiple places like program enrollment request. If a student want to change their program enrollment request, program enrollments from adding a major, minor, some of them are automatically done, some of them are done manually. By approving it or by rejecting it, we can all manage that as part of workflow. And a step is nothing but what what are we going to execute in that particular step? Like, is it a person that need to approve? Is it a human intervention required, or is it a system that automatically executes something at that particular step? So whenever a work travels through the steps in the workflow, so workflow event is at any point of time whenever it is a logging mechanism that actually says how a work has been traveled through the steps. And workflow state is a state of the workflow. It is a entity that defines the state of the workflow. And what is activity? Activity is a open source business process engine. It is using a business process model notation. So basically, we are going to have a standard. It's a standard definition. We are going to use the business process model notation to define these workflow. EagleApps API, EagleApps Workflow API is backed by this activity engine, because this activity engine is a general system that's being used by some enterprise applications as well. But this will help us to process our workflow design. This will help us to execute the works that's been executed, or it will help us to transfer or send a request to someone, and if the person approves it, or if there is any service changes that is required, if there is any process that will be executed in the backend, those things will be done in the activity. And it can be integrated completely, and we have a custom version of activity at Boston College, so that it has our own flavor in it. In that way, it is completely integrated with single sign-on, as well as adding groups whenever someone submits a request from EagleApps screens to create a course, create a program enrollment request, or anything. It will go to the appropriate groups for approval. So that's why we have this activity engine. What is a BPMN? BPMN is a business process model notation. Basically, it's a graphical representation of a flowchart, how a work or task need to travel. Okay, if a task is being approved by a set of a user, will it have to be going to say that, okay, if it is approved, what step do I need to do? If it is rejected, what step I need to do? So it's a graphical representation, and it will be helpful for the business to understand like what is happening, as well as the from the development side, we can actually define these in a graphical representation and say what group it needs to assign it to, so that someone can pick it up from the group. What is the who should I assign it to this particular task whenever a request comes into this particular step? So that's what the graphical representation of it. In the future, in the next, I'm going to show you how a workflow is designed in the activity. So this is a simple BPMN XML file. We have user tasks, we have service tasks, we have decision windows, we have start and end events. Let's go and see. So this is the activity API, but it's actually, as I told you, this is a custom version for Boston College. Let's say if I want to create a new process model. So if I want to create new process model, which I already have existing 2 process models, I can create one, or I can import an existing model that's been done by any other developer, or it's or myself, and I want to copy it into a new copy it and deploy it into a new environment. I can do it by importing the existing BPM XML files as well. So when we look at it, like this particular flowchart that we have is like, check the initiator, fill in the details, anything that has a user task in it. Anything that has user task in it needs a person to actually perform it. The rest of them, anything that is a service task, basically is being done by the system, saying that, okay, check initiator, check who is the initiator of this particular task. Is it a student services? Is it a student? Is it a department admin? Is it a dean? Who is the person that is doing it? so that we can capture that information. All this information will be stored in the EagleApps, and we'll capture that information using the services, and that information will be used in the process. So we can even more have we have more even more complicated stuff, like you can create sub process, you can create we can actually customize this process. So let's say a school has one kind of workflow, as well as another school want to have a different kind of workflow for program enrollment requests. Yes, we can do two different workflows, which can be a similar one, and it can be, the code can be some of the, like the check initiator class service task can be shared between these two workflows basically. So this is the basic process definition. And when we have you can actually go through, you can actually have multiple process definitions. You can deploy the process definitions as well from these screens. So, and we have the task app, basically the task app and program enrollment. These are the actual process definitions that we have deployed, and it's been used. And we have an identity management system where we actually we can manage these groups. Most of these groups we have it dynamically being created. We have a standard groups that were there. I just want to quickly show, like, these groups are the persons that actually can be used whenever we are trying to create or approve a request. So when we go to the Kickstarter app, if I see who is the assigned group over here. So if the candidate group ID is, if the candidate group ID says that this particular, yes, it's assigned to one candidate group ID, which we are actually setting dynamically, but the value actually will be one of those groups that were defined in the group section. But from our implementation, what we are doing is we are trying to create those groups as we create authorizations in EagleApps. So whenever someone creates authorizations in EagleApps, it's going to come back here, and it can be backed by the population, which Tom has explained earlier what a population is. It can be backed by a population service, or it can be backed by an authorization service. Yeah, we can work on that as well. And we have an admin screen. Admin screen is used particularly for the developers. Let's say developers are the admins that manages activity. So let's say I have a request that's been there, sitting there, like how many, I want to know how many requests are coming for a particular workflow, or what is the stage of each request. These are the different workflows that I have deployed, and from my application. And we have multiple workflows that are already be there, and we can change the versions, what version it is, and all this stuff. If I go to one of them, I can actually see how many requests. These are the number of requests that we have for each one of these workflows, and it can go right now. It can go from few to thousands and millions of requests as well. It can handle, as activity is a lightweight process. It's a Java. It's developed in Java. It's an open source process. It's already available in Git repository, and there is an enterprise version as well. But we are using a open source version. And if we look at this particular request, we can look at, for this particular request, what are the variables that are there. So some of the variables you can see, like the variables that we set it in the process in one of the service tasks, like workflow ID. What is the workflow ID we have? We define that over here. We set it over here. These are all done dynamically. So, and as well as we have sub process jobs. We have anything that says completed task. We have completed tasks. So we have all this information that is being stored in the process instances of the dynamic variables. And we can create jobs, we can have tasks, we can have configurations defined over here. And so what are the different tools that we have in activity? Activity has activity engine. That's a core component that actually processes these requests. Process reads this XML, creates a process instance, and whenever someone submits a work, whenever someone submits a work for a workflow, it automatically tries to process that request. Activity Designer, it's an Eclipse-based plugin that we are going to use for this for developers to actually design these PPM XML files. It can be designed from the Activity app as well. It can be used from Activity Designer as well, and it will be handy when you are developing and the XML is right. You can get the XML right away, and you can actually do active development on that. And we have Activity app. This is for everyone, identity management, task management, deployment process, everything we can manage it over here. Activity admin is to a higher level of get you list of all the tasks that are required. So these are the two UIs that we will have. And Activity REST API. The Activity REST API is actually being used by us to back whatever the screens that we have in the UI. How do we actually submit a request? How do we actually retrieve a request? All this information from EagleApps workflow to Activity, we are going to use the Activity REST APIs. And this is the Activity database schema, like how we actually can interact with the Activity API. We will be calling these are some of the services that we are using in order to interact with Activity through our workflow API. And yeah, how is EagleApps interacting with Activity API? How is EagleApps interacting with the Activity API? What is Activity related to? What is Activity when compared to workflow? So we have an Activity admin screen. As I showed you, Activity REST API is basically a REST implementation. You get the results. Activity app is the user UI. It is actually backed by the Activity schema. As we already seen. Workflow Activity Impl. Workflow Activity Impl is the actual implementation that we have in EagleApps that is backed by Activity. So whenever someone submits a request, initiate a workflow, then the process definition will be created back in Activity, as well as we can change that to whenever someone says like, okay, I want a version 2 of a course workflow. Yes, we will be submitting a request through workflow. Whenever I want to submit a work, we'll be sending it to workflow Activity Impl, saying that submit a course for approval. And how do I track it? I get the results as of what is happening in the Activity database, and it's already been backed by the Activity API schema. So we get all the results using the REST APIs, Activity REST APIs. So these are some of the existing workflow requests that we already have, like course workflow, program workflow, program enrollment workflow, exception workflow, course substitution, and grade changes. And we can have as many as, and we have for each workflow can be customized, can be maintained in multiple versions. Each workflow can be split down into multiple things like, oh, for copy operation, I need to perform this particular flow. And for create operation, I need to perform this particular flow. For program enrollment, for each school, I want to customize in such a way that for one of the school, I want to do it in a way that it goes to department admin, then student services, and then dean. So the other school, if I have a rule that says that if I want to directly submit it to a dean for approving a program enrollment request, and for school 3, if it says that any program enrollment request, just approve it. It is not required for anyone to look at it. So all these things we can split down into multiple things, but these are the overall workflows that we already have. I think Dale, I think you can.
Yep. Thank you very much, Rasha. So first and foremost, thank you to Tom and Hasha for the presentation for today. I know during the session, we've responded to any questions that may have come in and chats, but I want to make sure to see if there are any additional questions at this time. Again, this is a much deeper dive to provide a perspective and understanding on the technical side of the customization and configuration of the EagleApps system. And sometimes quick questions are not always evident. So there is one question that has come in from our one of our colleagues over in Europe, from Alex. And so I'll just read it, and maybe we could get someone to address it. How flexible is the system to include, for instance, new learning objectives on complementary curriculum activities? His interest is in social and sustainable interests of students that belong to a no subsystem of learning activities or projects, or a sub app. Again, pretty specific question, but I don't know if Tom or you want to try to address that at all.
Well, in terms of learning objectives themselves, you can define your own learning objective hierarchy and associate those with activities or formats or courses. Now, the second part of that, that belong to a new subsystem of learning activities or projects, not quite sure about that.
Okay. I think Tom, this is Jeff. It might be I mean, a corollary question might be, and given that there are lots of different sort of competency frameworks out there, would it be possible for someone setting up EagleApps to point it to some external set of learning outcomes or learning outcome hierarchies?
Oh, yeah. So in the case of where there's already learning outcomes or objectives that are predefined out there, and you want to make use of them, a couple of different ways to do that. One is you could simply import that data into the existing learning objective service implementation, have that persisted in the EagleApps database and make use of them. It also is possible to take the learning objective service interface and implement that so in real time it is going after learning objectives that are managed external to EagleApps.
Great. Thank you, Jeff, for jumping in. Tom, thank you for the answer. Alex, if you need more description or conversation on that, just email us. You know how to do it as an active member of Dexterra. And I'll give one last chance. Any other questions that need to come in? Give that a moment. As that, we're giving people that moment to do that. Just a reminder that this is the second in the series for the EagleApps community webinar. The following schedule, oops, forgot to change it here, apologize for that. April 30th is about program management and academic records, and then May 7th will be about the community and the implementation studies going forward in the process there in a collective discussion. Double checking one last time for questions. Seeing no additional questions, I would like to thank those who have joined us as attendees today and our presenters, as well as the entire team from Dexterra and Boston College who work behind the scenes to make this possible. We look forward to having you and additional participants next week join us for the session on program management and academic record. With that, I would like to say thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Great job.
Thank you, Mike.
And thanks to our visitors for participating. Great job, Harsher and Tom.
Excellent. Bye, everyone.